Our keynote speaker, Dance, has already mentioned that she is Marquette. Even though not in Marquette, she will always be Marquette and will always return to Marquette. Okay, so she is assistant professor in American Indian Studies at the University of Minnesota. Her area of focus is Native American literature, especially contemporary literature in Dakota and Ojibwe writers and the Great Lakes region. She teaches classes in literary studies as well as classes that intersect with indigenous environmental perspectives, museum and archival philosophies, and race and ethnicity more broadly. She is one of the co-creators, remember I said about Marquette? She is one of the co-creators of Marquette University Indigeneity Lab, supporting both graduate and undergraduate research in Native American and indigenous studies, especially the development of a context website that speaks to Marquette's Bureau of Catholic Indian Missions records and history of Native American boarding schools in the U.S. I'm glad she also helped me to pronounce it. So even if I fail to do that, my apologies, but I will try. She is a co-PI of the Ochetishwak Owin Remapping Project, a digital archive of oral narratives connecting Dakota and Lakota stories to place. Her topic is homecoming, relational justice, and care for the environment from a Dakota perspective. Dr. Samantha, please.
Midaku yepi, chantea washte na pe chuzapie, samamaki apie, damakota, ka Assiniboine, ka Wamashichu, ihanktua hemacha, ka wakchincha oyate hematahan. Wana bede oto tuwe edwatit ka hekta omaka zaptan ekta makoche washte otuwe ebwati, dayan wahari, Wopiratanka Chichiapie. Allow me to translate my greeting. My relatives, I shake your hand and greet you with a happy heart. I'm Sam Majhor. I'm Dakota and Assiniboine. I said also that I said Wamashichu. I am also non-native with a background mostly French and Dutch, a little bit of a mix going on there. I am specifically, and I said this, Yankton, Dakota, and I'll talk about that a bit more, a descendant from Fort Peck, Sioux, and Assiniboine Nation, and at the moment I live in Minneapolis, but up until a few months ago, I lived here in Milwaukee for almost 6 years. I said it is good to return to this place, especially as I'm going to talk about various kinds of homecoming today. And today does feel like a homecoming. I'm grateful to be with you all today, and I hope you'll join me in offering a big thanks once again to the conference organizers and to all the participants who are going to share papers in the next couple of days. So I'm really excited to be here and hear other presentations and look forward to the discussions we will have. I want to start with a little bit of a word map here from Dakota language. And I'm going to talk about, the many possible roads of going home, of homecoming. And I want to start with this word cloud, and these are all Dakota words that I associate with the idea of moving homeward or returning home. You have, tiata, toward the home. You have words for returning and coming and going. And as you can tell, in Dakota language, I don't know if I've even, scratched the surface as far as listing all the many ways we talk about home going and homecoming in Dakota language. As I get started and I'm thinking about language and words, it'll be helpful as I move forward and move through some history to define what I mean by certain terms that I'll use sort of interchangeably. So you'll hear me use the term Ocheti Shakoin. Dakota, I've already used. Lakota, I'll use sparingly, but when I say Dakota, I also mean Lakota. And so it may be helpful to know that Ocheti Shakoin translates to the 7 council fires. And the people who make up those council fires go by a number of names. In many history books still today, we are referred to by an exonym, a name we don't call ourselves, but that was applied to us. And so you might have heard of the Great Sioux Nation. This is who I'm talking about when I say Ocheti Shakoin or Dakota. Even more specifically, we could refer to the names of those 7 council fires. The Sisituan, the Wachbetuan, Wachbekute, Berewakantuan, Ihanktuan, Ihanktuana, and Tituan. For ease of reference, I'll be referring quite a bit to the Ihanktuan, or in the anglicized version, Yankton Council Fire, because I'll be referencing my own family history from that line. But I will use Dakota and Ocheti Shakoin interchangeably to talk about the people of the 7 council fires as a whole. So just a little terminology to start with. Any questions about the terminology before I go on? All right. Yes?
Where did the name Sioux come from then?
The word Sioux is supposedly a shortening from an Ojibwe word, shortened by the French and sort of francophone, and so it's not a name we called ourselves. It comes from outside. And if you were to talk about Ojibwe or Anishinaabe people, their exonym, or a name that was applied to them, is Chippewa, again from the French. So in many cases from Native nations, you will find this like double and triple naming that goes on that makes it very confusing. So I want to start by letting you know who exactly I'm talking about. But thank you for that question. Yes?
Yes, and how does your specific people view the term Sioux today?
How do we view the term Sioux today? It's complicated. Some of us grew up saying I'm Sioux, and sometimes what we grow up with is hard to let go of, and I would say if a Dakota person calls themselves Sioux, that's their right to do so. Many of our Native nations' formal titles with the U.S. government, and many of sort of the formally used terms in government paperwork is still the Sioux. And so to some extent, it's still in use and is sort of has to be. But I think in large part, we are reclaiming our languages, we're reclaiming our names for ourselves. And so that is preferred if you're writing about Dakota or Ocheti Shakoin people. Yeah, thank you. Okay. I'm going to talk a little bit about my research project because it relates to the topic at hand. So my research focuses on the vibrancy and animacy of the material world from an Indigenous perspective, and the significant meaning of this vibrant materiality that it has for the material conditions that carry stories. Those material conditions can include human bodies, other than human bodies like rivers, all manner of print culture, and computer servers. These are different examples of embodied texts that I think about. Indigenous perspectives on materiality speak directly to Indigenous spiritualities, of course, in ways that will, I hope, become obvious in this talk. But I'm not a spiritual expert. Rather, today I aim to emphasize both the material and discursive relations to place and environment that continue to define what it means to be Dakota. My work in recent years has sent me into a number of settler archives. For instance, right here at Marquette in the holdings of the Bureau of Catholic Indian Missions, the Newberry Library in Chicago, through teaching in the NCASE, the consortium there in Native Studies, and now just recently as interim director of the Darcy McNichol Center. I've worked with the Field Museum on an article that I published about a blue Dakota dress and its animacy and work, and with the curation of an exhibit at Marquette's Haggerty Museum of Art not too long ago. These settler colonial archives create clear structures of meaning in the way that they collect, arrange, and control objects that have stories to tell. Many of these archives hold objects that emanate from Indigenous communities and shape the way that they're allowed to speak. This is part of the colonial and settler colonial project. Now, for just over 2 years, I have worked on and thought deeply about what it means to co-create and caretake an Oceti-Sakowin archive. The Oceti-Sakowin Makoche Owapi, or what we sometimes call remapping the Oceti-Sakowin project, challenges the colonial mapping practices that have worked to define, limit, and separate Dakota, Nakota, and Lakota homelands, peoples, and knowledges. The reach of a digital archive opens up new possibilities for reconnections across the Oceti-Sakowin diaspora. I'll talk a little bit more about this diaspora, how we moved away from homelands in exile. By creating a digital map that connects stories to place, our project gathers stories offered by Oceti-Sakowin communities, especially the 16 U.S. tribal nation communities, as well as important urban communities in Rapid City, Bismarck, and the Twin Cities. Our long-term goal is to extend this project into the Oceti-Sakowin communities across the Canadian border as well. We are in the midst of developing a story archive that honors the wishes of story sharers in our communities, and such a story map that has the dynamic possibilities to include an interplay of audio, textual, visual, and virtual experiences will serve as a resource for language and cultural revitalization. Our first 2 years were marked by researching and strategizing ways to engage digital technologies that allow story sharers to maintain sovereignty over their stories and their data. And so that's been a big part of the project. But for today, I want to connect to this project by sharing my own story connected to place. My discussion today comes out of this sustained work of connecting story to place in a way that reveals and reanimates our relations and responsibilities. And I want to talk about a place that I recently visited for the first time, which surprises me even to say that. In fact, I visited just a few weeks ago knowing that I wanted to talk about it today. And I visited Pipestone National Monument in southwest Minnesota. As the story goes, the people had forgotten to live as human beings. And so the spirit that animates the waters sent up a great flood. The blood of those who had forgotten themselves became what is now known as pipestone, sometimes called catlinite. We call it Ian Shah, the red rock. This red rock, true to the story, is made from an interaction of ancient iron-rich rock with water that became mud, and after its long compression is now the stone that runs like a ribbon through what is called Sioux quartzonite. Unlike the quartzonite, which is a type of sandstone, Ian Shah presents a smooth and more malleable stone. The red stone has been quarried by Native people for thousands of years. And in particular, it is sacred to Oceti-Sakowin people and other Native nations in its use as the bowl of the ceremonial pipe. Eanshaw is only located in southwest Minnesota. Although notably Native nations have used a variety of sacred stone types for the bowl of different pipes, distinct from one another and prized in various forms from various quarries across North America or Turtle Island. One of the things I'll just say about the pipe to keep in mind as I move through is that this pipe is made out of rock, and then tends to, the sort of reed of it, the stem is made usually from certain types of wood. And that connection between the rock and the wood and the chanshasha or tobacco mix that you put into the pipe for smoking is often used, almost, I should say not often, it is used ceremonially. Sometimes this gets called a calumet or a peace pipe, but I was recently given, a reminder that for Dakota people, it is not exclusively a peace pipe. It is a pipe for prayer, which is slightly different, as we might imagine. It is not only for diplomacy between humans, it is, we might say, diplomacy between human beings and other than human beings, with Wakan Tanka, the great mystery that animates us all. So just to keep that in mind. When I visited a few weeks ago, the morning air was a bit cool and the sky was dappled with clouds, shading the landscape in rich colors of early fall. Plant life is abundant, and little signs noting various elements of prairie fauna dot the trail that takes visitors on a 3/4 mile loop around the National Monument. As I came to the stone monuments, mostly Sioux quartzonite with a ribbon of Eanshaw sometimes appearing at ground level, I wondered where the water was. Our traditional ecological knowledges embedded throughout Dakota storytelling helped me to know that there would be water somewhere. As I moved along the trail, I rounded a bend, and a sound rose up like the wind, moving heavily through these rocks and trees. It was a sound that surrounded me, and I stopped to take in this particular place and all the things connected to it. When I think about pipestone, I think about my 7 times great-grandfather and a journey he made from the plains of Minnesota, Makoche. Minnesota is a Dakota word that basically translates as where the waters reflect the sky. So it speaks to that place and its features. He traveled from what is now the state of Minnesota to Washington, D.C., arriving in that capital city at the turn of the new year in January 1858. Mato Sabichia translates to bear who paints himself black and refers to his ability to disguise himself for successful hunting. In the history books, his name is anglicized, as we're talking about language here, as Smutty Bear. Kind of unfortunate. And so I will reclaim and restore his name in the Dakota throughout this talk. He was part of a sweeping delegation of Indigenous leaders from Northern Plains and Great Lakes regions, ushered to Washington, D.C. in that year in order to sign land cessions. Whenever I read histories of his journey, including a notation and short description for this Ambro-type photograph, which can be found in the Smithsonian, it is noted as one of the first photographic images of Native Americans, very interestingly. The words "under duress" appear with regularity. And so I want to underscore that here. While the known itinerary of the delegates to D.C., like Mato Sabichia, include the performance of war dances and attendance at public balls, he and his comrades signed the 1858 Yankton Treaty under duress. Mato Sabichia had signed at least 3 previous treaties with the U.S., starting with the 1825 Peace Treaty at Prairie du Chien. Only a few years before this 1858 trip, he had signed the 1851 Treaty of Fort Laramie. And in that same year, other Dakota leaders signed treaties at Traverse des Sioux and Mendota, a series that ceded hundreds of thousands of acres of Dakota land in Minnesota in exchange for money and provisions that never came. And yet I can only imagine that the 1858 treaty signing was an entirely different experience, far from home and in all fairness held hostage in the settler colonial capital for months on end. As the story goes, Matosa Bichia and other reluctants were taken out into the Atlantic Ocean in a small boat and terrorized until they acquiesced, among other tactics. In the end, and after 4 months away from home, over 11 million acres of land were ceded with the promised exchange of money and provisions, again, promises that remain unfulfilled. Of course, this so-called treaty directed many turns in the 160-some years between that time and my own. But this treaty signing history, which does haunt me at times, isn't what I tend to think about as much as one might imagine. What I do often think about, and what was top of mind during my visit to Pipestone, is the significant stipulation in Article 8 of that particular treaty. I think I have it here for us. Or do I? Here we go. These are some additional photographs that were taken at the time of the treaty signing. And here on the right, you see Matosa Bichia in the center, and then he's on the right-hand side of that first photograph. But Section 8 of the treaty, Article 8, reads, "The said Yankton Indians shall be secured in the free and unrestricted use of the red Pipestone quarry, or so much thereof as they have been accustomed to frequent and use for the purpose of procuring stone for pipes, and the United States hereby stipulate and agree to cause to be surveyed and marked so much thereof as shall be necessary and proper for that purpose, and retain the same and keep it open and free to the Indians to visit and procure stone for pipes, so long as they shall desire." In some reports, it is only with this stipulation that certain members of the Yankton delegation, including Matosa Bichia, would sign. I understand this stipulation as a stark connection point between me and my ancestor. I read within it a charge of reciprocity and a call to responsibility. As Matosa Bichia and his relatives took care to ensure the access to this home of sacred stone for future generations, it is mine, our responsibility, the many of us who are descended from Matosa Bichia and other leaders, to continue to care and be in good relation with Pipestone, both the site and the stone, and to forward this practice with an eye toward the next 7 generations. Pipestone is not only a place or a relation for which I bear this kind of responsibility, but it serves as a strong entry point for describing a Dakota framework for what it means when we talk about relationality and justice. As one might imagine, carrying out our obligations to Pipestone has been fraught due to the intervening years between Matosa Bichia and I. In the years that follow, I often teach about what happened just 4 years after the signing of the 1858 treaty in 1862. After the additional removals to smaller and smaller parcels of land, encroaching settlers meant that the deer had been hunted and Dakota people were no longer able to follow game to hunt. The crops in 1862 had also failed, and so Dakota people were starving. The food and the money that were promised in the treaties were withheld. The Indian agent who was meant to distribute food and funds preferred to distribute the cash and goods all at once. And so even though there was food in the storehouse, Dakota people didn't have access to it. It wasn't being let out. The desperation and antagonism grew that summer until the situation became a tinderbox ready to go up in flames at the slightest spark. And of course there was a spark. In August, the war began when in Acton Township, 4 hungry Dakota hunters, after arguing over eggs stolen from a homestead, killed 5 Euro-American civilians. When they reported what they'd done, Dakota leaders had a choice: face the consequences of this act without a fight, or seize the moment to try to take back their homelands. Some Dakota leaders joined together to fight. Others avoided the conflict, even though they would soon be embroiled in the consequences, no matter their decision. It's important to keep in mind that at this time, many Dakota people in the region had Euro-American kin, and many mixed-blood Dakota were torn and had to make difficult choices. War happened. The war went on for 6 weeks. Dakota warriors attacked homesteads, Fort Ridgely and New Ulm, and they fought pitched battles with the U.S. Army and civilian militias. Many Dakota opposed their relatives and saved colonists from death and protected them after they were captured. As always, the story is deeply complex, and I'm giving it short shrift here. The war resulted in the death of an estimated 600 non-Native lives and U.S. soldiers. The Dakota death toll from the war is unknown and went uncounted. In the aftermath, the first Minnesota governor in that freshly minted state, Alexander Ramsey, declared, quote, "The Sioux Indians of Minnesota must be exterminated or driven forever beyond the borders of the state." A price was put on the scalps of Dakota people, especially warriors, and many fled. The Dakota people who hadn't fled west turned themselves into Camp Release near Mankato, or were rounded up and brought there against their will. And in just 3 weeks, a military commission tried almost 400 Dakota men for their participation in the war and sentenced just over 300 of them to death. Some of the trials lasted no longer than 5 minutes. At that time and ever since, the legal authority of the commission and its procedures have been questioned. In October, officials decided to send those Dakota who were considered non-combatants, the women, children, and elderly, to be encamped at Fort Snelling. The Dakota women, children, and elderly began the walk to Fort Snelling in November. Imagine a Minnesota November. They numbered 1,658 people. Dakota people still share stories of the long walk, where some Dakota people died, as one might imagine, from disease and in some cases violent abuse from settlers along the way. The non-combatants were put into a concentration camp below Fort Snelling at Badote. This is why you will hear Dakota people refer to Badote, which is the meeting of the Minnesota and the Mississippi rivers, a sacred place, as a site of both our genesis and our genocide. Disease, cold, and starvation characterized the Dakota experience in the camp, and an estimated 300 people died over the winter. What you see on the screen on the right side is a photograph. That is a photograph, not a drawing or a painting of the encampment I'm talking about. And I'm using language specifically. The Minnesota Historical Society, who has ownership over the site, and Fort Snelling, which is on the sort of rise above the camp there, they use this particular language of genocide and concentration camp specifically on their website after much historical review. Meanwhile, speaking to the image on the right side, the 300 men set for execution were held at Mankato. President Lincoln, who was in the midst of managing the Civil War, it's important to think about that context as well, was sent, the execution list, in which he sent back to them and said, "We cannot hang 300 people right now. You will have to whittle it down." So they did. And he eventually signed the execution letter and approved the execution of 38 men who were hanged in the largest mass execution in U.S. history on December 26, 1863. And that is the image that ran in papers across the nation, that was emblazoned on plates and silver spoons as memorabilia. That just last year when I was in a little vintage shop in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, this was framed on the wall that could be purchased. In the following years, 2 more Dakota leaders were hanged, this time at Fort Snelling. And in 1866, the remaining men, the rest of the 300 that hadn't been hanged, had been sent to Davenport, Iowa, where they spent years imprisoned there. The women, children, and elderly, after the thaw, were also put on ferry boats down the Mississippi and then up the Missouri to establish a reservation called Crow Creek, where conditions there were terrible and people continued to die. One of the reasons that the Minnesota Historical Society, again, uses these particular terms, the terms of genocide, is part of this aftermath and the separation of childbearing men and women, which doesn't allow them to procreate, and is again a feature of trying to extinguish a group of people. This is a dark history. And yet I grew up in the Minneapolis area completely unaware of this history and my own family's connection to it. And so I want to take us along that road a little bit. There's so much to say here. But since this time, the law that mandates Dakota exile from the state of Minnesota is still on the books. This is a handy map, but I'm going to move over it. But this just is a map that describes the movement of everyone post-war and the diaspora. In my family, the daughter of Matos Abichia, her name was Red Blanket. And as you might think, a woman who is the daughter of a treaty signer of an important man, she was married at the time to a French fur trader, and his name was Francis Lacherit. They had a daughter named Lizette, and she was born in what we now call Minnesota. And I know, tracing the census records, that for whatever reason, I have my suspicions, but not any certainty, she left Minnesota just years before 1862, maybe a year or two before that, and was in Nebraska when the war broke out. She eventually marries yet another French man named another Francis Bercier, and she has a daughter, Elizabeth, who in the latter half of the 19th century ends up at Standing Rock Reservation. Standing Rock Reservation transverses both South Dakota and North Dakota. So you think just in the middle of the Dakotas, there you have Standing Rock Reservation. And that's where we find my great-great-grandmother, who I have excellent photographs of. You see her from left to right here, younger, with one of her first babies in the middle, with the majority of her children, and then in old age here on the right. Among them, in the center photograph, on the very right side, you see a little boy, and that is my great-grandfather, Benedict. Now, he grew up at Standing Rock and then went further west. He ends up going to Fort Peck Reservation. Oh, more pictures of Elizabeth. He ends up going to Fort Peck. Here you see him on the ranch at Fort Peck. And he goes there and he marries a woman who's in the upper right corner here. Her name is Rose Sears, and she's an Assiniboine woman from Fort Peck. They're married for a short time, and they have 2 children, including my grandfather, Walter Majhor. Okay, he's the little boy here in the first 2 photos, and then here with his sister on the right, his younger sister Gladys. And they're a young family, and this is the early part of the 20th century. And this is a really, really hard time for Dakota people and Indigenous people across the country. I mean, the time I just spoke about might have been the hardest, but there were more hard times to come. And in this case, my great-grandfather Benedict dies of an early death. We have a series of early deaths. Benedict dies from the 1919 flu epidemic. The little girl here in the picture, my grandfather's sister Gladys, passes away in the early part of the 20th century at about age 19. She had just been married about a year before. I'm not totally sure. She has a surgery, she has things going wrong, and she's sent to a place in Rapid City called the Sioux Sanitarium, which is a tuberculosis hospital designated and segregated for Native people. And so my great-grandmother Rose is left alone and probably inevitably struggling on the reservation, and she sends her son to boarding school. I don't have all the details of when he traveled from eastern Montana all the way to the Pacific Coast to Chemawa Boarding School in Salem, Oregon, but I know that he then grew up there. There was very little chance to come home from boarding school, and folks in the room may know something about the history of Native boarding schools. I have very little information about his time there, except that I know the history. And this was an assimilative program, forced assimilation. You have loss of language and forced conversion and things like that at the boarding schools. Now, my grandfather, like many young men, especially young Native men coming out of boarding schools, went right into the armed services. So he joins the Air Force when he comes out. And I often think about the boarding schools as either the boarding school to military pipeline, as we have here, but sometimes the boarding school to prison pipeline. Okay, so we want to think about these institutions as connected in their carceral nature. But my grandfather leaves, he joins the military, he serves stateside during World War II. He doesn't go and see battle, rather he is an instructor in the United States, and he marries my grandma June. That's a photo of them on their wedding day. And they have 3 boys together. One of them is my dad, and my dad has 5 years before his dad, my grandpa Walter, passes away, also very young, at about the age 40. The age I am now, near about. And he passes away suddenly. And so in my family, you have what I think is a common story in Indigenous people's lives, is a series of early deaths, a series of disconnections that are connected to state colonial actions. I want to move to today. Today, I am lucky enough to be part of revitalization movements and movements like Land Back. I'm lucky enough to be able to go to Pipestone and think about what my 7 times great-grandfather would want me to do in this moment. There's a really prominent article, now it's really ubiquitous in Native American studies, by scholars Tuck and Yang called Decolonization is Not a Metaphor. They came out with this article in 2012. It outlines a number of what they call settler moves to innocence. And I want to just highlight one of those moves to innocence that they define, and they call it free your mind and the rest will follow. They say, quote, "We wonder whether another settler move to innocence is to focus on decolonizing the mind or the cultivation of critical consciousness as if it were the sole activity of decolonization. To allow conscientiousization to stand in for the more uncomfortable task of relinquishing stolen land. That's on page 19 in Decolonization is Not a Metaphor. They continue, decolonization, quote, is not converting indigenous politics into a Western doctrine of liberation. It is not a philanthropic process of helping the at-risk and alleviating suffering. It is not a generic term for struggle against oppressive conditions and outcomes. The broad umbrella of social justice may have room underneath for all of these great efforts, worthy efforts. By contrast, decolonization specifically requires the repatriation of indigenous land and life. Decolonization is not a metonym for social justice. End quote. That's on page 20. When I think about Tuck and Yang's call for, quote, an ethic of incommensurability, and the insistence on decolonization is not a metaphor, I think about my kinship obligations, both human and other than human, and I think about the possibility of homecoming for Dakota people. Indigeneity is often defined in opposition to or as a response to colonial and settler colonial structures. There's an ongoing discussion in Native American and Indigenous studies that asks the question, is indigeneity always co-constituted by colonial structures? Or is there a definition of indigeneity that can be extricated from settler colonial structures? How do we define indigenous? Is it a binary like black and white? Is it forever ever tethered to settler colonialism or colonialism? It's a question I don't have the answer to, but it's one I think about a lot. And I think in the context of this particular conference, I want to just put forward a question that I'm hoping in our conversations we maybe keep in our back pocket, or perhaps I'll hear addressed in presentations. And I don't ask this question to sort of equate indigeneity and Christianity. I think these are different things, but I think we can borrow each other's questions in a good way. So I'd ask, and I wonder, how has Christianity been co-constituted by its development of and participation in settler colonial structures? As it has provided much of the architecture of colonialism across the globe, can Christianity be understood outside of the dynamics of colonial structuring? And if it can be, what does it look like? I want to return to my visit to Pipestone. As I walked along the trail and the rushing wind came up, I came around the next bend and I realized, of course, it was not the wind that was surrounding me, although it does gust around water, but a beautiful waterfall that I'd heard rushing around me. All my life, I'd seen and touched Ian Shah, the red rock, in the form of amulets and pipes, but I had never visited the storied place that developed it. I spent a long time on the trail taking in the relations from the rock formations, the running water, the bird life, the gnarly oaks, and the Dakota practitioners who were out quarrying early on that Sunday. My thoughts turned toward my own known and unknown ancestors who made the same connections to place, and I especially thought of Mato Sabichia. As Tuck and Yang have declared, decolonization is not a metaphor, and neither is homecoming. The realities of our relational responsibilities it's not simply to admire or protect, but to participate in care for our common home, if I may borrow from Pope Francis there. These things are materially before us and made even more manifest as I send my thoughts forward to the next 7 generations. Pidamaya yapiye. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Samantha Majhor. I would say, and I think everybody here would agree with me, as I was listening to you, I was impacted, in between moved to tears, because the story resonates with me. But let me not make it my own thing. Before we throw it open for questions, please, we have refreshments behind. Help yourself. If you are thirsty, have something to drink. We have some cookies. Help yourself as well. So we now throw it open for questions. Would you want to direct the questions yourself? Mm-hmm. Okay.
Jump in.
I'm always fascinated by languages. And so I'm wondering, and bringing your language back, you know, I have Irish roots, and bringing that language back hasn't been all that successful. Did it completely die out?
For Dakota language, no. There have always been speakers. I will say, so I went to the University of Minnesota as a grad student. I'm now there as a professor 6 years later. But when I was there as a grad student, I got to take Dakota language. So I'm a Dakota language learner. I didn't grow up with it. And at that time, when I was there, you know, in the 20 teens, there were 5 speakers in Minnesota. Now, this doesn't mean there weren't fluent speakers who had grown up with the language, which is how we define it, elsewhere in the Dakotas, you know, again, in that diaspora up in Canada. There are, you know, a good number of speakers. Are there enough? And are enough people growing up with it as their first language? That is what we might say imperils the language. And yet at the same time, I'm very optimistic about language and what our people are doing with it. My language instructors are my heroes in this life. And at the University of Minnesota, I don't mean to keep plugging Minnesota, but in the American Indian Studies department, you can major in Dakota language. And so the idea is to reproduce Dakota language teachers who then go home to their communities, speaking of homecoming, and continue to revitalize the language.
And what you said about whether you can uncouple indigeneity from colonialism, it seems to me that language loss is almost always part of the colonial experience.
Yeah. The comment is language loss is almost always part of the colonial experience. Absolutely, it's a critical part, as well as the removal of children from their homes for re-education, right? In the sort of colonial structuring strategies, that is a key to it, and in many ways, across the globe, it's been highly effective. Now, language revitalization, resuming our cultural practices, insisting that treaties be honored, insisting that we have not just access, because we have access to a place like Pipestone, but now we need to talk about whose hands it should be in, right? So there's always room. And yeah, can we decouple indigeneity from the history of settler colonialism? Maybe not. You know, what has happened, but we're co-creating the present and the future together. And what are those possibilities, right?
Good afternoon, ma'am. As someone with a large amount of my family living in South Dakota, I understand firsthand that there's still a lot of tension between the natives and I guess the colonials. What do you think the best steps to repairing that relationship would be?
Yeah, what's the best steps? I'm just repeating for our folks online, to repairing relationships between Native people and non-Native people, and let's just put it in the U.S. context for now, because we could really look at this globally with Indigenous peoples and relationship with colonial powers or settler colonial powers. I think, now I'm looking at my friend from Canada here. Canada has gone through a process of truth and reconciliation regarding their boarding school or residential school histories. A first step here would be truth-telling. We've got to tell the truth about our shared history. And I know, because I teach, that so many students come into my class with very little knowledge about our shared history and very little correct knowledge, okay? The truth of what's happened that is documented in settler archives, which I referenced. We need to start by telling the truth to each other. And we need to allow that to empower all of us, like I said, to co-create a future, right? The vision of the future has to include us all. And I think there are possibilities. That was a broad answer to that question, but it starts with telling the truth and being brave enough and not being scared that our history can be ugly.
So then, follow-up question.
Yes.
Do you think it gets worse before it gets better?
Do I think it gets worse before it gets better? Yes, I do. And again, I'm going to refer to what's happened in Canada, right? You had a truth-telling process. You had a legal process that restored or recompensed survivors of the residential school system there, survivors of sexual abuses that happened there. And yet we have seen in Canada, that pendulum swing of feelings, right, about this, and tensions run high. It is inevitable that when we tell the truth, some will not be ready to hear it, and then you get blowback. That's just my observation.
Right.
Does that mean we shouldn't do it? I mean, I don't have the answer to that. I know where I stand on it, but we have to ready ourselves.
Yeah, I think it depends where you are to, and a people's will to change.
Mm-hmm. Now, just as education was the key to forced assimilation, education might be the key to where we move through this together.
Right.
I hope. Thank you. Hands. I don't know who was first, so I'll come up front first. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I'll preface my question with some comments. First of all, I love the pictures that you ground yourself in history. And it's colonialism is a tool, it's a system of erasure. It produces colossal losses from different angles. That said, I was curious, why homecoming? Home is gerundic. It's not static.
Mm-hmm.
So why is the gerundic in the coming? Or because I was thinking, why not home going?
Yeah.
Because there's no staticity of where you are coming to. It's moving. And we cannot return.
Yeah.
But in our going, we find that which we have lost in the past. That said, I love what you talked about, stories connected to place and stories of maps. But in your research, I'm curious, how do you engage embodiment, the body as a map?
Oh, that's a great question. Do I engage the body as a map?
And what does that reveal?
And what does that reveal? I mean, I do by way of oral stories, which to me is an embodied archive, right? In order to pass on stories in oral tradition, you need to remember those stories, you need to practice those stories, and you need to speak them out and share them. And it's all embodied body-to-body practices. And I often tell my students that, and I feel very strongly about this, that the system of memory keeping that is body-to-body in oral tradition is incredibly effective as a memory-keeping mode, and incredibly powerful, incredibly sustainable, as long as you aren't being genocided. Okay. Likewise, I mean, there's the same fragility you find with any form of memory keeping. Libraries burn down, we leave books aside for the digital space could go out in a blink with the sort of one blast of the sun or whatever. It's all precarious, right? And so it takes care. And I think thinking about not just human embodied knowledge and this idea of embodiment, I think of embodiment also in the land, in the pipestone itself, right? It tells a story, and we just need to be able to translate it for ourselves. So I think about that a lot. I love that question, and I think you're right. I think I need to, I did wrestle with homecoming, homegoing, and am feeling today the sort of that multi-possibility of what it means, and can one ever go home if everything's always changing, right? Pipestone for me is not the same pipestone as it was for Matos Abichia, and it wouldn't be no matter what had gone on in between us, right? But there are those connectors too. Oh, I saw a hand back here, and then we'll jump up front.
Thank you a lot for your presentation. I love it. My question is, there is a African author from Kenya, and I didn't link his name correct. He said one of the main action of colonization was colonize the mind of people. Right? More than take the gold, take the riches, natural resources, the thing that colonize the mind. I want to hear your perspective on that from your community, in that even especially when you talk about the indigenous aspects always facing colonization, how in terms of the epistemological aspect of the mind, connect what you said before to education, how you feel that and how you make the challenge in your community, they feel they embody their own knowledge, their own views, or always have that sense that maybe feel inferior because that's what was made people to believe.
Yeah.
I work with Jews. I'm from Brazil, and I work with the Guaranis in Brazil. Is always have that challenge, that belief that was made, that to be accepted and to develop and to progress, you have to fit. Even now, that maybe don't have a very oppressive institution that will force them in a boarding school to assimilate, but still have that through other means that is impact inside.
Yeah. So the question is about the colonization of the mind and really the strength of that, and how do we how do we break free of a feeling that has been really impressed upon us and continues to be, I mean, in all sorts of rhetoric of inferiority. This is something I'm always pushing against and pushing back on in class with my students. There's so much we have to sort of decolonize or dismantle in even the notion of how we think about time and progress and who owns progress and who owns technology and innovation. And so for me, as a language person, as a literary person, it's about re-narrating the story. And I kind of hear something in your question about the feeling of ultimate loss. And there has been that loss. But if I may just tell a very quick story, when I was in the Dakota language classes, again, I didn't grow up with my grandfather. My dad hardly did either. And so I knew he had been to boarding school. I knew we were Native. I didn't know if he had any facility with the language. But I was taking language classes, and I called my grandma. And this is 40, 50 years after his death. I called my grandma, and I said, hey, I'm taking Dakota language classes. I'm telling her about it. And she starts saying Dakota words to me. Washte and Chahampi, which means sugar. And she didn't know what those words meant. She just recalled them from many, many years prior. And it let me know that my grandpa said, in fact, it was like my first conversation with my grandfather across time. Things come back to us in very interesting ways. These knowledges come back to us when we visit the stones, when artist friends of mine go into museums and look at baskets and how they're made and then take up the practice again in our dreams. There's lots of possibility for recouping who we are, I think.
Thank you very much for this wonderful presentation. And part of my question I think you have addressed, but if you have more to say, I will appreciate. I wanted to say in appreciating the talk that the expression that decolonization is not just a metaphor has to live with me for much longer. I really appreciate that. But regarding agency and the continuing effects of colonization, I was going to ask, do we think of colonization right now in Dakota as something that has happened and stopped? In that sense, okay, the colonizers are gone. But with regard to agency, what is the level of involvement of native people in that colonization?
Yeah.
And that will push me to cap the question saying, is there any sense in which colonization continues right now, or is it all gone and we are only dealing with the effects?
Yeah.
My other question is just for curiosity.
Okay.
Why North and South Dakota?
I don't know if I have the answer to that. Why North and South Dakota? Well, it was Dakota territory to begin with, and I don't know why they split it up. Someone knows. Historians know. That story hasn't internalized yet for me, so very interesting question. As far as is colonization over, is it ongoing? I mean, here in the United States, we're in a settler colonial state. And so settler colonialism is the structure of the state. It is ongoing. And then there is the perpetuation within our own communities in various ways of features of settler colonialism and colonialism, especially in the strategies that I see Native nations having to go through as far as their government to government, but also patron to ward relationship that's set up in our legal framework between the United States and Native nations. That is pretty interesting. So I would say it's ongoing, and I think it's interesting to look at the global context, right? Is there post-colonialism? What is post-colonialism? Where is it? How is it achieved? What are the struggles to become post-colonial? Yeah, I think we are in it. Yes. Thank you.
Chime Witch again, Sam. This was an incredible presentation, and so grateful that you were able to share your voice with us and stories and language. But I really found it really powerful that you also brought Pope Francis into dialogue there at the end. And I have a question just regarding, a lot of this entire, the entire story of colonization is it's inseparable from the doctrine of discovery, and an important kind of some of his final acts while he was still with us, Pope Francis repudiated the doctrine of discovery. And I'm just wondering what you might think, even kind of reflecting on the question that you kind of gave us to kind of reflect on as well. Was the repudiation of the doctrine of discovery, was it merely words, or was it a call to action? As Christians, do we have, is there something that's that we're called to do about trying to repudiate, and what that means from land, from reconciliation, from our common, protecting our common home. So, just curious if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, is Pope Francis's repudiation of the doctrine of discovery, is that sort of a discrete act, or is it something that, I think you can tell where I would go with this. Is it something that should resonate as a call for action and really a dismantling of those things. Now, very, very tricky to dismantle doctrine of discovery because it is embedded in precedents in U.S. law. Now, again, I don't know about Canada.
Luckily, it was overturned, so
Okay.
it's no longer precedent in Canada. But
Okay.
for the states, it absolutely is.
So again, we have some models to look to for potential pathways forward and work to do. Undoubtedly, there's work for all of us to do together. That is my stance and my call for sure. Yes. One more?
I'd like to thank you for a couple of things, and then ask a question. I'd like to thank you for your method of personal discovery of the past, and through that, drawing us into what otherwise we would call history.
Yeah.
There's facts out there. So I thank you for that. And then your underlining the false innocence of settler mentality, which I suppose at least a lot of us have. So thank you for those two things. On colonialism, I'd just like to suggest a complication, because I think when we're talking about colonialism, we're always talking about modern colonialism. Mm-hmm. And so to critique colonialism isn't the same as critiquing, let's say, the Roman Empire's extension through the Roman regions up into northern and western Europe,
Right.
which also could be considered colonizing. And that's the background for many of the settlers.
Yeah.
But that's never considered colonialism, and rightly so, I think.
Yeah.
But what's the difference?
I think this is a great question. What is the difference between modern colonialism, which might be a more specific way of naming the history I'm outlining here, and just the history of people, the movement of people, the encroachment of people on other peoples? I think about things like in Minnesota, Makoche, I have many Anishinaabe and Ojibwe friends. They migrated in from the Great Lakes at a certain period, and in not a small, well, I don't know who can compare, but with some violence came into what were traditional Dakota homelands, right? And yet there is a difference, and I see this connected to the history of race and racialization, and then that proliferation and the technologies that allowed us to move around the globe with much more speed, weapons of lethality and things like that. So I think there is a way to distinguish, and I would look to kind of those elements and those specific histories, right? And that's the same as we should do with the question of genocide that comes up. Not to bring in the comment section of social media, but you'll often see people, respond to genocides by people who've always been killing each other, or, kind of, very base responses. But it needs to be answered and explained. And this is why education is the answer, right? Is that we're talking very specifically at a certain point of modern genocide, which is differentiated from brutal killing and swaths of killing historically, right? It is within the frameworks of the development of issues of different issues, the idea of race, the idea of sort of east-west, the idea of, and the mechanics of technology. So that's where I would go.
My question is not directly related to what you presented. My question is just for us to have opportunity to draw from your own experience and from your own knowledge about one of the things we are discussing in the classroom. Mm-hmm. So, and the thing is, we have the view that the story of Adam and Eve is one of these stories. It's not the only story. So I want to see whether from your own indigenous tradition, do you have stories that typify, resembles the story of Adam and Eve, indicating that you are descended directly from God?
That's a great question. Do we have a story in the manner of Adam and Eve that suggests we are directly descended from God? Ooh, I am not the expert in that, in the sense of what I would answer to this are my own personal instincts as far as our stories and what they're telling us. I showed the concentration camp at Badote, and our origin story for Dakota people has us emerging from water as a people. And for some of us, that story is at that meeting of the rivers. For others, it's up north in what we call B'nai Wakan or Mille Lacs Lake. Out west, there's emergence from a cave. And so there are stories, absolutely. But I tend to think I'm careful about it because we've gone through the history of colonization, and it is difficult even for us to read these stories without influence, the outsized influence of Christian conversion and Christian stories, which I will say, Genesis is the story in the Bible that I've read the most because it's at the beginning, and I'm fond of it as a story. Yeah.
I want to check whether there are some questions
yeah.
because this conference is hybrid, so a good number of people are also joining us virtually.
Let's see if I can go to chat.
Okay, there is no.
I don't know if they've been able to chat.
Yeah. Let me see whether anybody is there right now. Participants, 4 people. Okay. Hello, David, Evaristus, and Ngozi. If any of you have any question, you have opportunity to turn on your mic and ask the question, or you can put the question in the chat, just to make sure we give you equal opportunity as well to participate actively, in case you have any question. Thank you. All right, continue. While we wait for them, is there any other question? Yes.
Yeah, so while we wait for them, thank you so much for your presentation. I think I have 2 or 3 questions, but I will stop once they make their question. You began by saying you are not that spiritual, but then the presentation is very spiritual because you can't talk about indigenous people here and not see the spirituality.
Yeah.
So I'm curious why you said that.
Well, to be precise, I said I'm not a spiritual expert. So within my community, I really try and stick to my role in education, and much of my educational rhetoric, putting my family history in here as a rhetorical move, very specifically done, is geared toward, I know it resonates with Indigenous audiences, but is also geared toward non-Native audiences. And there are sensitive issues in spirituality, so I am not an expert. I would say I am spiritual myself, personally. But yes, and so it comes through, and that's what I was hoping, is that much of that would be read between the lines of the puzzle pieces.
Okay, so since there's no question yet,
Yes.
so I read a work by an indigenous scholar whose name is escaping me right now. The author said the question who is indigenous, when posed, the answer depends on who is asking it and why it is being asked.
Yeah.
Because it's a question of power and land. So what's your response to that?
Yeah, how do we define indigeneity? Who gets to say who's indigenous or not? It's a huge question. It's a particularly fraught question in our university spaces now for at least in the Native North American context. There have been there's been a proliferation of folks who are not Indigenous who make those claims. and then draw on the resources and sort of positions that in many ways Native people should fill. So we're having a huge conversation about that now. And I think it's also something that many, and I'll speak for myself here, many Indigenous people have wrestled with for themselves. Am I Indigenous enough? What does it mean to be Indigenous? If I don't have my language, if I don't have my family knowledge, if I'm not enrolled as a tribal member, my dad is enrolled, I am not enrolled. Okay, so we're at that generation tipping point. What does that mean? And much of the sort of even Indigenous populations, but people outside of our own contexts, define indigeneity in ways that we do not. So I think it's always in contention, and I think as Kim Tallbear, who's now my colleague, and I'm starstruck by her, I will say, as she says, it's about who claims you. Does your community claim you? And what does that mean? And so Indigenous people have their own unique ways within their tribal nations of claiming people. And so I think that is a good rule of thumb. And I always look to Kim Tallbear on those kinds of questions.
Just continue.
Yes.
Okay, this is the last one. I think I've been preempted by Dr. Simon Ebwen. So it has to do with this homecoming. So it's like, because when you were talking about homecoming, I was like, where is home?
Yeah.
So where is this home going? So where are you going to?
Yeah.
So when you speak about homecoming, where is this home? Even though taking note of Simon's objection, but where do you think is home?
I mean, I don't have just one home. If I can claim all of, and we'll put an asterisk by this too, but all of traditional Chetishakowin homelands as home, I would take it. But I also think home is people. Home, we find home in sort of like various modes, and I don't want to, limit the play on that. Especially as I think a lot about materiality, right? And interaction and agency. So I certainly felt that sense of home when I visited Pipestone, which was a long time coming. I've been thinking about that place for a long, long time. I've known it. And to be there and know that I will be revisiting the place and reconnecting to it in various ways. I don't know how to answer the question, honestly, in a specific way. But I think that is maybe the use and the problem of the term, right? Is that it's so all-encompassing. But I'm also, in the end, when I gesture to Pope Francis, care for our common home, it's this planet. I mean, we all are interconnected and invested. And so I think the move is not my particular home. It's what are we going to do to care for the home?
Can I just add to that quickly and say, if we ground home as homing, a gerundic movement, we are first of all the first place of home is our bodies. But our bodies are not static, they are gerundic. They are always moving.
Yes.
And in the moving, they share and they collect and all that stuff. So where is home is in the process of this being moving through history. And there are moments of highlights of our serious consciousness, and there are low moments as well. So that is it. Home is not where it's all butterfly feeling all the time.
Right.
But it is this fullness, this gerundic, concentric circle of movements was there. That said, I would love to go back to the second comment, the question, who is indigenous? It's a valid question insofar as hegemony still exists.
Yes.
That once you get rid of hegemony, that question never arises. The question arises as a response to hegemony.
Yeah. I mean, that goes back, that is exactly the question we're wrestling with, right? Is there an indigeneity outside of the context of colonialism and settler colonialism? Very difficult to get there, right? I mean, yeah, great point.
Well, Tom,
Just one.
Go ahead.
In all that you've presented and what we've discussed, it's right to keep the people foremost, but the land is part of it. Mm-hmm. And I think that would be a wonderful area if we were going to continue.
Yeah.
What the relationship to the land, place is good, but the land, I mean the actual rivers.
Yep.
And forests and mountains.
Absolutely. I was just lecturing last week on the beaver, and during the fur trade, sort of the almost hunted to extinction for furs that made hats, right? But when we think about what the beaver do, their relationship to the land, the creation of dams, the flooding of banks, and how this changed our rivers. To this day, our rivers and ecosystems are absolutely changed. So thinking about that network, thinking about our relation to those things, I think really critical in this moment, and we don't do enough, right? Yeah. Wopira Danka Chichiapie, thank you so much.
Thank you.